The gavel had not even touched the table when the Duke of Harrogate turned to Eleanor Ashcombe and told her, in front of 40 people, that her opinion had not been requested. The room went quiet. Someone near the window coughed to cover a laugh. Eleanor did not flinch. She held the fan in her gloved hand a little tighter, and she smiled, and she lowered herself into a curtsy so graceful that anyone watching would have thought she had just received a compliment instead of an insult. The Duke expected her to shrink. Men like him always did. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a coat the color of wet slate, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have never once been told no. He had inherited Harrogate Hall at 22, doubled its income by 30, and buried 2 wives along the way, without ever once being asked how he felt about it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His voice was already the loudest thing in any room he entered, simply because everyone had learned, over the years, that disagreeing with him cost more than it was worth. Eleanor Ashcombe was 34 years old, a widow of 4 years, and she had walked into that auction preview room to look at a crumbling stone manor called Thornfield, with the same quiet curiosity she brought to everything. She had noticed water damage along the east wall. She had noticed the foundation stones were older than the house itself, older even than the recorded deed, which was strange, because old foundation stones in that part of the country usually meant one thing. She had opened her mouth to say so, gently, to no one in particular, the way a person thinks aloud. That was when the Duke had turned. He had assumed she was talking to him. He had assumed, further, that a widow in a plain gray traveling dress had no business assessing the value of an estate he intended to buy for sport. He said the words sharply, the way a man swats a fly, not even bothering to look at her twice. I did not request your opinion. Eleanor's curtsy lasted exactly as long as it needed to. When she rose, her eyes met his for 1 full second, and in that second, something passed between them that the Duke did not notice, and would not have understood if he had. It was not anger. Anger burns hot and empties itself quickly. What passed through Eleanor in that moment was colder and far more patient. It was the particular calm of a person deciding, quietly and completely, that they have just been handed a reason. She left the room without another word. Outside, the afternoon was gray, and the wind carried the smell of coming rain. Her carriage was waiting at the end of the lane, and her driver, a steady older man named Edmund who had served her late husband's family for 30 years, opened the door and studied her face with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read her moods from small signs. He did not ask what happened inside. He simply said, "Home, my lady," and she nodded, and they rode in silence for the first mile. It was Eleanor who broke it. "Edmund," she said, "do you remember old Mr. Pruitt, who used to survey land for my husband's family?" Edmund glanced at her in the small mirror above his seat. "I do, my lady. Retired now, living out past the mill." "I need to speak with him," she said. "Tomorrow, if possible. And I need you to say nothing of it to anyone." Edmund did not ask why. He had driven for the Ashcombe family long enough to know that when Eleanor's voice went quiet, and even like that, she was not making an idle request. She was building something, brick by brick, in a place no one else could see yet. That evening, alone in the study that had belonged to her late husband, Eleanor lit 2 lamps instead of 1, and pulled down the old estate ledgers she kept in the bottom drawer of the desk, records that dated back decades, land surveys, mineral reports, county maps marked in her husband's careful hand. She was not a woman who had been raised to manage money. She had been raised, like most daughters of her class, to manage a household, to plan menus, to make polite conversation at dinner. But her husband, in the 2 years before his death, had taught her something most men of his rank never taught their wives. He had taught her to read a ledger the way other people read a letter, to see, in a column of small numbers, the shape of a much larger story. She found Thornfield's name in an old survey, dated 11 years earlier, tucked between records of 2 properties that no longer existed under those names. The survey had been conducted for a mining company that later folded before publishing its findings. It mentioned, in dry, technical language, a vein of high-grade slate running beneath the eastern fields, the same fields whose foundation stones she had noticed that afternoon. Slate of that quality was in growing demand for roofing across the northern counties, where the old thatch roofs were being replaced faster than local quarries could keep pace. The Duke did not know this. Eleanor was certain of it. If he had known, He would not have spoken of Thornfield the way he had spoken of it in the preview room, as a decorative purchase, a pretty ruin he intended to restore for the pleasure of owning something old. Men like the Duke bought estates the way they bought horses, for how they looked from a distance. They rarely bent down to examine the ground beneath their feet. She closed the ledger near midnight, but she did not go to bed. She sat by the window instead, watching the last of the lamplight flicker against the glass, turning the day's insult over in her mind. Not with anger now, but with something closer to gratitude. The Duke had underestimated her in front of a room full of witnesses. He had done her the great favor of assuming she was harmless, and a person who is assumed to be harmless is given, without ever asking for it, the freedom to move unwatched. The next morning she visited Mr. Pruitt, a small, sharp-eyed man in his 70s, who had spent 40 years reading land the way other men read faces. He remembered the old mining survey well, remembered the vein of slate, remembered too why the mining company had folded before it could act, a matter of bad investment in London, nothing to do with the quality of the stone itself. He confirmed everything the ledger suggested and added detail the ledger lacked, told her how the vein likely ran, how deep, how it might be reached without disturbing the house itself. By the time she left his cottage, the rain had started, soft and steady, and Eleanor walked to her carriage without hurrying, letting it fall on her shoulders, thinking not of the Duke's voice anymore, but of numbers, of what Thornfield was worth on paper, and what it was actually worth, beneath the ground. Two very different figures, that no one else in the county seemed to know were different at all. She had 4 weeks until the auction. She intended to use every day of them. Her first stop after Mr. Pruitt was not a bank. It was the small stone church on the edge of the county, not for prayer, though she said one anyway, but because the churchyard adjoined the old parish records, and parish records, unlike bank ledgers, were open to anyone who asked politely. She wanted to know who had owned Thornfield before the current family, how long they had held it, why they had let it fall to ruin, instead of selling it years earlier when the roof first began to leak. A house does not decay by accident. It decays because someone, somewhere, stopped caring what happened to it, and Eleanor wanted to understand exactly who that someone was, and why. The parish clerk was an elderly man with ink-stained fingers, who seemed delighted that anyone under the age of 60 still had an interest in old records. He pulled down 3 heavy volumes and left her alone with them at a long wooden table, and Eleanor spent the better part of 2 hours tracing Thornfield's ownership back nearly 100 years. The pattern that emerged was not dramatic. It was simply sad. 3 generations of a family called Whitmore had held the estate, each one a little less careful than the last, each one selling off a little more land to cover debts that were never quite explained in the records but were easy enough to guess at. Cards, horses, the particular kind of pride that spends money it does not have in order to appear as though it does. The last of the Whitmores, a widow herself, had died 2 years earlier, with no children to inherit, and the estate had passed to a distant cousin in London, who had never once visited it, and who was now, through his solicitor, offering it for auction, simply to be rid of the burden. That explained why the current asking price was so low. It was not low because the estate lacked value. It was low because the man selling it had no idea what he was selling, and no one who did know had bothered to tell him. Eleanor closed the last volume and thanked the clerk, and walked out into the churchyard, where the rain had stopped and a pale sun was breaking weakly through the clouds. She stood for a moment among the old gravestones, thinking about the 3 generations of Whitmores who had let a fortune crumble beneath their feet, without ever once looking down, and she thought too about the Duke, who was about to make the very same mistake for the very same reason. He did not think a woman's eyes were worth trusting. He would learn, in time, that this was a very expensive thing not to trust. Her next task required more delicacy. She needed money, and more of it than her own modest income could provide, and the only way to raise that kind of sum quickly and quietly was to speak with a banker who could be trusted to keep both her interest and her silence. She thought immediately of Mr. Whitlock, a man her late husband had done business with for years, known through the county for being sharp but fair, and, more importantly, known for treating his clients' business as strictly their own. She sent word that afternoon, requesting a private meeting, and he received her the following morning, in his office above the county bank, a narrow room, lined with heavy books, and a single window that looked out over the market square. He was a compact man, with silver at his temples, and a manner of listening so complete that people often found themselves saying more than they had planned to. Eleanor laid out the ledgers, the survey, Mr. Pruitt's confirmation, the parish records, everything, in the order that told the story most clearly, and she watched his expression change slowly from polite attention to genuine interest as the picture assembled itself in front of him. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "You understand, Lady Ashcombe," he said, "that if you win this auction, half the county will assume you have taken leave of your senses, spending a fortune on a ruin, while the other half will assume you have done it purely out of spite toward the Duke. And neither assumption will be correct, and neither will matter, because the moment the slate vein becomes known, everyone will understand exactly what you have done, and by then, it will be too late for anyone to stop you." "That is precisely what I am counting on," Eleanor said. He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him in the whole meeting, and he told her he would need 3 days to arrange the necessary funds discreetly, structured in a way that would not draw attention before the auction, and that, in exchange for his discretion, he would ask only one thing: that she remember, when Thornfield began producing income, that his bank had been the one willing to trust a widow's judgment, when a duke would not have trusted it at all. She left his office, with the beginning of a plan taking real shape beneath her, no longer just an idea sketched out in ledgers and church records, but something with actual weight behind it, actual money waiting to be called upon. She had 3 weeks left. The Duke, she suspected, was spending his in exactly the way she wanted him to, confident, careless, telling anyone who would listen that Thornfield would be his within the month, certain that no one in the county had the will, or the means, or the audacity to stand against him. He was wrong on every count, and he did not yet know it, and Eleanor intended to let him go on not knowing it for as long as possible, because a man who believes he has already won is a man who stops paying attention, and a man who stops paying attention is a man who can be beaten in full view of everyone he has ever underestimated, with nothing more than patience, a curtsy, and a smile he mistook, from the very first moment, for surrender. Over the following days, Eleanor moved through her ordinary routines, exactly as she always had, calling on neighbors, attending the small gatherings expected of a woman in her position, saying nothing about Thornfield to anyone outside the small circle who already knew. It was, in its own way, the hardest part of the plan, harder than the ledgers or the meetings with Mr. Whitlock, because it required her to sit across a tea table from women who spoke admiringly of the Duke's plans for the estate, who called him generous and forward-thinking for taking an interest in such a neglected property, and to nod along as though she had no opinion on the matter at all, when in truth, she had never had a stronger opinion about anything in her life. She heard, second-hand, that the Duke had mentioned the auction preview to several friends, laughing about the widow who had tried to lecture him on foundation stones. The story had grown a little in the retelling, as stories do, until it was no longer quite accurate, until Eleanor herself became, in the version passed from parlor to parlor, a slightly foolish figure who had embarrassed herself trying to sound clever in front of a duke. She heard this version from Lady Beaumont, her closest friend in the county, who delivered it not unkindly, but with real concern in her voice, worried that Eleanor's reputation was being quietly worn down by a story she had no way to correct without making things worse. Eleanor only smiled when she heard it, the same smile she had given the Duke in the auction preview room, and told Lady Beaumont that some stories were worth letting other people finish for you, because the ending, when it came, would surprise them far more than anything she could say now. Lady Beaumont did not understand what she meant, not yet, but she trusted Eleanor enough not to press, and she left that afternoon with the distinct impression that her friend was holding something back, something larger than pride, something that would eventually explain itself in its own time. It was 2 weeks before the auction that Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time, to walk the grounds of Thornfield alone. She told the caretaker, an old widower named George, who had stayed on the property out of loyalty long after the last of the Whitmores had died, that she was simply an interested buyer, wanting a closer look before the sale. He let her in without question, an old habit of hospitality that had outlasted the family he had once served, and he left her to wander the grounds while he returned to his small cottage near the stables. She walked the eastern fields slowly, in the low afternoon light, looking at the ground the way Mr. Pruitt had taught her to look at it, noticing the slight rise where the old survey said the slate ran closest to the surface. Noticing, too, the way the house itself sat above it all. Cracked and weathered, but fundamentally sound. Its bones good, even where its skin had failed. She stood for a long while at the edge of the eastern field, imagining what the land might become. Not the decorative ruin the Duke pictured, but something alive again. Something producing. Something that would let her build a life entirely on her own terms, for the first time since her husband had died. It was on that walk that she made a decision she had not fully allowed herself to consider before. That whatever happened at the auction, whatever it cost her, she would not let this chance pass simply because it frightened her to reach for something this large. She had spent 4 years being careful, being modest, being exactly the kind of quiet widow society expected her to be. And she was tired of it, in a way she had not admitted even to herself, until the Duke's voice, sharp and dismissive, had cut through that quiet, and reminded her what it felt like to want something badly enough to fight for it. She left Thornfield that evening, as the sun dropped low over the western hills, and she did not look back at the house the way a buyer looks back at a property they are still deciding on. She looked back at it the way a person looks back at something that already, in some essential way, belongs to them, and she carried that feeling with her all the way home, through the 2 weeks that remained, through every quiet meeting with Mr. Whitlock, every careful word exchanged with Lady Beaumont, every moment spent sitting across from women who still believed, without knowing any better, that the widow Ashcombe had learned her lesson and would trouble the Duke no further. They would learn otherwise soon enough, and Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was looking forward to it more than she had looked forward to anything in a very long time. Mr. Whitlock kept his word, and on the 3rd day he sent a small folded note to Eleanor's house, asking her to call on him again before noon. She went alone this time, without Edmund waiting outside, choosing instead to walk the short distance from her home to the bank, so that no one watching her carriage would think anything unusual of the visit. A widow calling on her banker was ordinary enough. A widow's carriage sitting outside a bank for the better part of an hour was the kind of thing that drew questions in a county where very little of interest happened between one market day and the next. Whitlock's office smelled of ink and old paper, and he had a fresh set of documents spread across his desk when she arrived, arranged with the same careful order she had brought to her own ledgers. He explained the structure he had built for her, a private loan secured not against Thornfield itself, which could not yet serve as collateral for a property she did not own, but against a portion of her late husband's remaining investments, modest on their own but sufficient, combined with her own savings, to give her real strength on the day of the auction. "It will not make you the richest bidder in the room," he told her plainly, "but it will make you a bidder no one can easily dismiss, and more importantly, it will let you go higher than anyone expects a widow of your means to go, which counts for a great deal when your opponent is a man who has never once had to imagine losing." Eleanor studied the figures for a long while, turning the page slowly, doing the sum in her head the way her husband had taught her, checking it twice before she spoke. "And if I win," she said finally, "and the vein proves smaller than Mr. Pruitt believes, or the quality poorer than the old survey suggests." Whitlock did not rush to reassure her. He respected her too much for that, she realized, and the realization steadied her more than comfort would have. "Then you will have paid a fair price for a fine old house with good land around it," he said. "Not a fortune made, but not a fortune lost either. I have seen worse risks, taken for far weaker reasons than the ones you have shown me this week." She left his office with the papers folded carefully inside her cloak, and for the first time since the afternoon in the auction preview room, she allowed herself to feel something closer to excitement than resolve. The plan was no longer only an idea living inside her own head. It had a shape now, a structure, numbers on a page that other people had looked at and found sound. That evening, Lady Beaumont called on her unannounced, arriving just as the last light was fading from the sky, and Eleanor found her friend standing in the front hall, with an expression that mixed worry and curiosity in equal measure. "You have been strange all week," Lady Beaumont said, without waiting to be invited further inside. "Strange in a way I cannot place. You smile at the wrong moments and go quiet at the wrong moments. And when I mentioned the Duke's plans for Thornfield at Mrs. Pelham's tea yesterday, you looked at me the way a cat looks at a bird it has already decided to catch." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the first in days, and she led her friend into the small sitting room, where a fire had already been lit against the evening chill. She hesitated only a moment before deciding that Lady Beaumont, of everyone in the county, had earned the truth, not because she needed an ally exactly, but because keeping the whole of it locked inside herself had begun to feel less like discipline and more like loneliness. She told her everything: the foundation stones, the old mining survey, Mr. Pruitt's confirmation, the parish records showing why the estate had fallen so low in price, the arrangement with Whitlock. Lady Beaumont listened without interrupting, her expression moving slowly from disbelief to something like awe, and when Eleanor finally finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "You intend to buy Thornfield out from under the Duke of Harrogate," she said, not as a question, simply repeating the fact aloud, as though testing its weight. "I intend to buy Thornfield," Eleanor said. "That the Duke also wants it is his misfortune, not my design." Lady Beaumont studied her for a long moment, then began, unexpectedly, to smile. "Do you have any notion," she said, "what this will do to him, publicly, if you succeed? Men like the Duke do not simply lose a bidding contest. They lose a story about themselves, the story where they are always the strongest man in the room, and once that story cracks in front of witnesses, it does not mend easily." "I am counting on that as well," Eleanor admitted. Her friend reached across and took her hand, squeezing it once, firmly. "Then you will need help keeping this quiet until the day itself," Lady Beaumont said. "Because I promise you, if even a whisper of this reaches the wrong ears before the auction, the Duke will find some way to raise his own funds higher, or worse, find some way to have the sale delayed until he has time to do so. Men with titles have more doors open to them than women with sense, however unfair that remains." Together they spent the rest of the evening working through exactly what needed to be protected and from whom, which servants could be trusted absolutely, which acquaintances were prone to gossip even when they meant no harm by it, how Eleanor should behave in public over the coming days, so that nothing in her manner gave away the shape of what she was building. It was strange, Eleanor thought later, how much easier the work became once she was no longer carrying it entirely alone, how a burden shared did not become half as heavy, but somehow less sharp, less likely to cut her if she stumbled. The following days settled into a careful rhythm. In public, Eleanor was exactly the woman the county expected her to be, attentive at church, pleasant at tea, quiet on the subject of the Duke and his plans for Thornfield whenever it arose, which it did often, since half the county seemed to have an opinion on the matter, and most of those opinions favored him. In private, she met twice more with Whitlock to finalize the last details of the loan, visited Mr. Pruitt a second time to walk through his old notes on the slate vein in greater depth, and spent long evenings with Lady Beaumont mapping out, almost like generals planning a campaign, exactly how the final days before the auction ought to unfold. It was during one of these evenings that Lady Beaumont raised a concern that had not yet occurred to Eleanor, though it should have. "The Duke is not a fool, whatever else he is," she said, turning a teacup slowly in her hands. "If he begins to suspect, even faintly, that someone intends to challenge him seriously for Thornfield, he may quietly raise his own reserve before the day arrives, simply as a precaution. You must give him no reason to suspect anything at all. Better still, give him reason to believe the opposite." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, and an idea began to form, small at first, then clearer. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "I ought to let it be known, gently, through the right people, that I have decided not to pursue Thornfield further, that the Duke's comment in the preview room embarrassed me enough that I have resolved to stay well away from the sale entirely." Lady Beaumont's eyes brightened with something close to admiration. "Let the story that is already being told finish itself," she said, echoing Eleanor's own words back to her. "Let them believe you have shrunk exactly as they expected you to." It was, Eleanor reflected as she walked her friend to the door that night, a strange kind of power, learning to use the low opinion others held of her as a kind of armor, letting their carelessness become the very thing that gave her room to move. She had spent years being underestimated, without ever once benefiting from it. Now, for the first time, she intended to make that old habit of theirs work entirely in her favor. Over the following week, the rumor spread exactly as she had hoped, carried from parlor to parlor by women who had no idea they were carrying anything but idle gossip. Mrs. Pelham mentioned it at her own tea, that poor Lady Ashcombe had been quite embarrassed by the whole business, and had decided the wisest course was to withdraw from the matter entirely. Another woman added that she had heard Eleanor intended to spend the season visiting her sister in the north instead, an embellishment that had no basis in truth, but that Eleanor did nothing to correct when it reached her own ears secondhand. She heard, through Lady Beaumont, that the Duke himself had laughed when the story reached him, remarking to a friend that he had known all along the widow would come to her senses once she understood her place. The words stung less than Eleanor expected them to. If anything, they steadied her further, confirmed that the story was doing exactly the work she needed it to do, closing his eyes precisely when she needed them closed. 10 days before the auction, she received a note from Mr. Whitlock, informing her that the funds were fully arranged and would be available to her the moment she required them, discreetly held, in a manner that would not draw attention from the county's usual channels of gossip. She read the note twice by candlelight, then folded it carefully, and placed it inside the same drawer where she kept her husband's old ledgers, the drawer that had, over these past weeks, become something like the heart of the entire plan. That night she dreamed, for the first time in a long while, not of her husband, whom she still thought of often and with real tenderness, but of Thornfield itself, of the eastern fields under a clear sky, of the old stone house, standing whole and cared for, its windows lit from within. She woke before dawn and lay still for a long while, watching the gray light strengthen slowly at the edges of her curtains, and she found herself thinking not of the Duke's insult anymore, nor even of the satisfaction of proving him wrong, but of something quieter and more lasting, the simple, steady image of a life built entirely by her own hand, on ground she had chosen, for reasons no one else had bothered to see until she showed them. There were 10 days left. She meant to spend every one of them exactly as carefully as she had spent the weeks before, giving nothing away, letting the county believe precisely what it wished to believe, while beneath the surface, patient and unseen, the ground was already shifting toward the day when everyone in that auction hall would learn all at once how badly they had misjudged her. The Duke of Harrogate did not think of Eleanor Ashcombe again for nearly a week after the auction preview, and when he did, it was only in passing, a small, satisfied thought that flickered through his mind, the way a man remembers winning an argument he barely noticed having. He had other matters occupying him, matters he considered far weightier than the opinion of a widow with a plain gray dress and an unusual interest in foundation stones. His steward, a careful man named Percival who had served the family for over a decade, had been asking to speak with him privately for 2 weeks, and the Duke had put him off each time, first claiming urgent correspondence, then a prior engagement, then simply forgetting the request altogether, amid the pleasant business of planning what he would do with Thornfield once it was his. He pictured new stables, a restored ballroom, perhaps a hunting party each autumn, that would draw guests from 3 counties. He did not picture, because he had never once been forced to picture it, the state of his own accounts. When Percival finally cornered him, quite literally, in the narrow hallway outside the estate office, the Duke agreed to hear him, only because there seemed no polite way to refuse a third time. "Your Grace," Percival said, closing the door behind them with a care that suggested he did not wish to be overheard, "I must speak plainly about the matter of Thornfield, and about the state of the household accounts more generally." The Duke settled into the chair behind his desk, with the faint impatience of a man who considers a conversation already finished before it has properly begun. "Speak plainly then," he said, "though I cannot imagine what requires such ceremony." Percival laid a small stack of papers on the desk, each one covered in neat columns of figures, and began, with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment more than once in his own mind, to explain what those figures meant. The renovations to the north wing of Harrogate Hall, undertaken the previous spring at the Duke's own insistence, had run considerably over their original estimate. The new carriage, purchased in the summer, had been paid for outright rather than financed, a decision that had seemed reasonable at the time, but that had drawn down the estate's liquid funds more sharply than anyone had anticipated. And the horses, 4 of them, purchased at auction only 2 months earlier, for a sum that Percival read aloud, in a voice carefully stripped of any judgment, though his face suggested plenty of it. "Taken together, Your Grace," Percival said, "the funds available to you for an additional purchase such as Thornfield are considerably narrower than they were even 6 months ago. I would not say the purchase is impossible. I would say it requires caution, and perhaps a reserve set well below what you might otherwise consider fitting for an estate of that description." The Duke listened to all of this with an expression that shifted over the course of the explanation, from mild irritation to something closer to boredom. He had heard versions of this speech before, from Percival and from his father's old steward before him, men who seemed to believe that a duke's confidence needed to be checked against a column of numbers, the way a farmer checks his fences. He did not doubt the figures. He simply did not believe they applied to him in any way that mattered. "Percival," he said, when the steward finally paused for breath, "Thornfield is a ruin. Everyone in the county knows it is a ruin. The current asking price reflects that, and I do not intend to pay a farthing above it, because no one else will either. There is no widow in this county foolish enough to bid against me for a crumbling manor with a leaking roof, and certainly no one with the means to do so even if they wished it. I could win that auction with half the sum you are so worried about." Percival hesitated, then, in a smaller voice, mentioned the widow from the preview, the one who had spoken about the foundation stones before the Duke had cut her off, wondering aloud whether her observation had perhaps been worth more consideration than it received. The Duke laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and waved the thought away with his hand. "That woman," he said, "does not know a foundation stone from a garden wall. She spoke because women of her sort like to feel clever in front of an audience, and I did her the kindness of not letting her embarrass herself further. No, Percival, there is no threat to my winning Thornfield. There is only the question of how much I choose to spend, and I choose to spend little, because there is no reason to spend more." Percival gathered his papers without further argument, though his expression, as he left the room, suggested he was not entirely convinced. He had learned, over his years in service to the family, that the Duke's confidence was not something easily argued with, and that the wiser course, more often than not, was simply to keep careful records and wait for events to prove their own point, as events, sooner or later, always did. Left alone in his study, the Duke poured himself a small glass of brandy and allowed his thoughts to drift back, briefly, to the auction preview and the widow's curtsy, the way she had smiled at him, even as he spoke to her sharply. He had thought little of it at the time, filing it away as one more small triumph in a life that had offered him a great many of them, but now, turning it over idly in his mind, something about the memory nagged at him faintly, though he could not have said what. It was not guilt. The Duke did not experience guilt easily, having been raised from birth to believe that his opinions carried a weight other people's did not, that correcting someone beneath his station was a kindness rather than a cruelty. It was something closer to curiosity, a small itch at the back of his mind, the sense that the widow's smile had contained something he had not quite finished reading before she rose from her curtsy and walked away. He mentioned her, a few days later, at a dinner with 3 friends from neighboring estates, men he had known since university, men who laughed easily at his jokes and rarely questioned his judgment. He told the story of the auction preview with the practiced ease of a man who has told a story many times before, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, until the widow in his account became more foolish and more thoroughly put in her place than she had actually been in the room that day. One of the men, a baronet named Fairfax, mentioned that he had heard, through his own wife, that Lady Ashcombe had since withdrawn from any interest in the sale entirely, embarrassed by the whole affair, and resolved to stay well clear of it. "There," the Duke said, raising his glass with satisfaction. "Precisely as I expected. A sensible woman, in the end, whatever foolish notion possessed her that afternoon." The conversation moved on to other matters, horses and hunting and the usual business of men who had never needed to think carefully about money, and the Duke thought no more of Eleanor Ashcombe that evening, nor for several evenings after. He continued his preparations for the auction with the same unhurried confidence he brought to everything, instructing Percival to set his reserve at a figure the steward considered reasonable, though privately Percival wondered whether even that figure left enough room for the unexpected. There was, in fact, one unexpected complication brewing in those same days, though the Duke remained entirely unaware of it. A distant cousin of the late Whitmore family, hearing that Thornfield was finally to be sold after 2 years sitting empty, had written to the solicitor handling the estate to express a faint, unofficial interest in bidding himself, a young man of modest means, but real sentimental attachment to the old house, where he had spent childhood summers before his branch of the family fell out of favor. The solicitor, a careful man who wished to see the sale conducted fairly, mentioned this interest to no one beyond a brief written acknowledgement, but it meant that the auction, whenever it came, would not be quite the uncontested affair the Duke so confidently expected, even setting aside whatever Eleanor Ashcombe might be quietly preparing on her own. None of this reached the Duke's ears, cocooned as he was in the comfortable certainty of a man who had never once needed to prepare for failure. He spent the remaining days before the auction, much as he spent every other day of his life, riding in the mornings, attending to correspondence in the early afternoons, dining well in the evenings, entirely untroubled by the growing quiet gathering around him, a quiet that was not, as he assumed, the sound of a contest already won, but the sound of several separate forces, unknown to one another and unknown to him, drawing steadily closer to the same appointed day. Percival, for his part, continued to review the accounts each evening, with a mounting unease he did not share again with his employer, having learned that a second warning would fare no better than the first. He simply made careful note of every figure, every expense, every narrowing margin, and told himself that whatever happened at the auction, he would at least be able to say, honestly, that he had tried to counsel caution when caution was still possible. The Duke, meanwhile, slept easily each night, dreaming, if he dreamed at all, of a restored Thornfield standing proudly under his own banner, a fitting addition to a life that had never yet handed him a single defeat he could not simply laugh away over dinner with friends who agreed with everything he said. 6 days before the auction, Eleanor received a visitor she had not expected and did not welcome, a thin, sharp-featured man named Mr. Coombe, who introduced himself at her door as an agent acting on behalf of a client interested in Thornfield, though he declined, with a smile Eleanor did not trust, to say precisely who that client was. Edmund showed him into the front parlor with obvious reluctance, and Eleanor received him standing, a small deliberate choice that kept the visit shorter than it might otherwise have been. "I understand, Lady Ashcombe," Mr. Coombe began, "that you made some remarks at the auction preview regarding the condition of the property, remarks that suggested a rather more detailed understanding of the estate than one would expect from a casual observer." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, the same composed stillness she had worn since the day of the insult itself. "I noticed water damage on an old wall, Mr. Coombe," she said. "I imagine anyone with eyes might have noticed the same." He smiled again, thinner this time, and let his gaze drift briefly around the parlor, taking in the modest but well-kept furnishings, the neat shelves of books, the small evidence of a household run with quiet competence rather than extravagance. "Of course," he said, "forgive my client's curiosity. It is only that Thornfield has drawn a surprising amount of interest of late, for a property that has sat neglected for 2 years without anyone troubling themselves over it, and my client wondered whether you had heard anything further of interest regarding the estate, anything at all, that might be worth sharing." Eleanor understood, in that moment, exactly what was happening, though she gave no sign of it. Someone, somewhere, had begun to wonder whether the old rumors about mineral value beneath Thornfield's fields held any truth, and Mr. Coombe had been sent to test the waters quietly, to see whether the widow who had spoken up in the preview room knew more than she had said, and might, carelessly or otherwise, reveal it now. "I have heard nothing beyond what any of your neighbors could tell you," she said evenly. "As I understand it, I have already made my own feelings about the sale quite clear. I do not intend to trouble myself with it further." Mr. Coombe studied her for a moment longer, and Eleanor held his gaze without wavering, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become slightly uncomfortable, a technique she had learned, without quite meaning to, from watching the Duke himself use silence as a weapon in rooms full of lesser men. "Of course," he said again, finally, rising from his seat. "Forgive the intrusion, I shall not trouble you further." She showed him out herself, standing in the doorway, until his carriage had turned fully out of sight down the lane, and only then did she allow the careful composure to slip, just slightly, just long enough to feel the small, cold thread of worry that had settled beneath her ribs during the entire conversation. Someone was asking questions. She did not know who, or how much they already suspected, but the timing troubled her deeply, this close to the auction, this close to the moment when every careful precaution still needed to hold. She sent word to Lady Beaumont that same afternoon, and her friend arrived within the hour, listening with a deepening frown as Eleanor described the visit in full. "Coombe works for several men in this county, who prefer not to attach their own names to their business," Lady Beaumont said, once Eleanor had finished. "I have heard the name before," always in connection with quiet inquiries of exactly this sort. It could be nothing. Idle curiosity from some investor who has heard the same old rumors everyone in this county half remembers about Thornfield's land. Or it could mean someone has begun to look more closely than we would like. Eleanor sat with this for a long moment, turning the problem over the way she had learned to turn over every problem since the day of the insult, patiently, without letting fear rush her into a decision she might later regret. If someone else suspects the value of that land, she said finally, then time is working against me faster than I believed. I cannot delay. Whatever happens, the auction must go forward on schedule, and I must be ready to bid whatever it takes on that day, without hesitation, because if word of the slate vein reaches wider ears before then, the price could rise beyond anything Whitlock has arranged for me. Lady Beaumont nodded slowly, though her frown did not fully ease. Then we must also consider, she said, whether Mr. Coombs' client might attempt to bid himself, quietly, through an agent, rather than showing his own face at the auction. You may find yourself facing not only the Duke on that day, but a second, unseen rival as well. The thought had not fully occurred to Eleanor until her friend spoke it aloud, and she felt the weight of it settle over her plans like a shadow crossing a field. She had built everything around the assumption of a single contest, herself against the Duke, her patience against his arrogance, the possibility of a third party, hidden and motivated by the same knowledge she possessed, threatened to unravel calculations she had made with such careful precision over the past weeks. That evening she wrote again to Mr. Whitlock, explaining the visit from Mr. Coombs, and asking whether the funds arranged might, if absolutely necessary, be stretched a degree further than originally planned, understanding fully the additional risk such a stretch would carry. His reply came the following morning, brief and characteristically direct, informing her that a modest additional sum could be arranged, though he cautioned strongly against relying on it, unless truly forced, since it would leave her financial position considerably more exposed than either of them had originally intended. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it and sat for a long while at her husband's old desk, thinking not of numbers now but of the deeper question beneath them, how far she was truly willing to go for Thornfield, for the vindication of that single moment in the preview room, for the life she had begun, almost without noticing, to build around the idea of the estate as thoroughly her own. She thought of her husband, of the quiet years of their marriage, the careful, steady partnership they had built together before illness took him far too early, and she thought of the 4 years since, years spent being exactly the sort of widow society expected, cautious, modest, never reaching too far for anything. She realized, sitting there in the lamplight, that what frightened her most was not the risk of losing money, considerable as that risk had become, but the risk of reaching this far, this openly, for something she wanted, and failing in front of everyone who had already decided, long before the auction, that a woman like her had no business wanting anything at all. She decided, in the end, that the fear itself was reason enough to continue rather than retreat. She had spent 4 years being careful. She was done being careful in the way that meant disappearing quietly into the expectations of others. The following day, she called on Mr. Pruitt once more, this time asking him a question she had not thought to ask before, whether he knew of any other parties in the county, beyond the Duke, who had shown interest in Thornfield's land over the years, anyone who might have heard the old rumors and kept them filed away, waiting for the right moment to act. Mr. Pruitt considered the question for a long while, his sharp old eyes narrowing in thought, before mentioning a name Eleanor did not immediately recognize, a merchant from the northern town of Ashworth, who had made inquiries some years back about slate deposits across the county more broadly, inquiries that had gone nowhere at the time for want of a willing seller. It was not confirmation of anything, but it was a thread, and Eleanor followed it that same afternoon, sending a careful, indirect inquiry through Whitlock's banking connections to see whether the merchant from Ashworth had recently renewed any interest in properties within the county. The answer, when it came 2 days later, was troubling enough to sharpen her resolve further. The merchant had indeed made a quiet inquiry through an intermediary within the past month, asking specifically about Thornfield's mineral rights, though nothing had yet come of it beyond the inquiry itself. Eleanor understood now, with total clarity, that the coming auction was no longer the simple, private contest she had imagined weeks earlier, herself against a Duke too arrogant to see what stood in front of him. It had become something larger and less certain, a race against time and against unseen rivals who might, even now, be quietly assembling their own funds, their own agents, their own plans, to seize the very prize she had worked so patiently to claim for herself. She did not allow the complication to shake her resolve. If anything, it sharpened it, the way a stone sharpens a blade, and she spent the remaining days before the auction in a state of quiet, focused readiness, reviewing every figure with Whitlock one final time, confirming every detail of the arrangement, with a precision that left no room for hesitation on the day itself. The night before the auction, she barely slept, not from fear exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a person standing at the very edge of something they have worked toward for weeks, watching the last hours before it arrives tick past too slowly and too quickly all at once. She lay awake, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, thinking of Thornfield's eastern fields under a starless sky, of the Duke sleeping soundly in his own bed, entirely unaware of how thoroughly the ground beneath his certainty had shifted, and of the merchant from Ashworth, and Mr. Coombs' unnamed client, both of them waiting somewhere out there in the dark, for the very same morning she was waiting for herself. When dawn finally came, pale and gray through her curtains, Eleanor rose without hesitation, dressed carefully, and stood for a long moment in front of her mirror, studying her own reflection with the same steady attention she had once given the ledgers, the surveys, the parish records. Whatever waited for her in that auction hall, she intended to meet it exactly as she had met every challenge of the past weeks, with patience, with preparation, and with the same quiet smile she had given the Duke the very first day he made the mistake of underestimating her. The auction was held in the great hall of the county assembly rooms, a building normally reserved for dances and public meetings, its tall windows letting in the thin morning light, and its wooden floor already crowded, by the time Eleanor arrived, with more people than she had expected. Word of a duke bidding on a county estate had drawn spectators as much as buyers, farmers and merchants, and curious gentlefolk who had no interest whatsoever in owning Thornfield, but every interest in watching a man of the Duke's standing spend his money in public. Eleanor arrived early, deliberately, choosing a seat near the middle of the hall rather than the front, close enough to see clearly, but not so close as to draw attention before the bidding began. She wore a dress of deep blue rather than her usual gray, a small private decision that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the fact that she did not intend to disappear into the crowd today, whatever else she chose to keep hidden. Edmund waited outside with the carriage, under instruction to be ready the moment she needed him, and Mr. Whitlock had promised to be present as well, seated somewhere near the back where he could observe without being obviously connected to her, a precaution both of them had agreed was wise, given how much still depended on no one guessing her intentions before the gavel fell. She watched the hall fill steadily over the next quarter hour, recognizing most faces from church and market day, exchanging small polite nods with neighbors who greeted her with the particular warmth people reserve for someone they believe has already been humbled once and poses no further threat to anyone's plans. Lady Beaumont arrived not long after, taking a seat 2 rows behind Eleanor rather than beside her, another small precaution, and gave the faintest nod as she passed, a signal that everything on her end remained as arranged. The Duke arrived last, as men like him always did, entering the hall with the easy confidence of someone who has never once worried about being kept waiting for anything. He wore a coat of deep green, finely cut, and he moved through the crowd shaking hands and exchanging brief pleasant words with the small circle of friends who had come to watch him win, Fairfax among them, along with 2 other gentlemen Eleanor recognized only vaguely from prior gatherings. He took a seat near the front, close to the auctioneer's table, exactly where a man certain of victory would choose to sit. Eleanor watched him settle into his chair, watched him lean toward Fairfax and say something that made his friend laugh, and she felt, beneath her own careful stillness, the same cold clarity that had carried her through every step of the past weeks. He had not looked toward her once since entering the room. She doubted he had even registered her presence among the crowd, and she found she preferred it that way, preferred to remain unseen until the precise moment when being seen would matter most. She noticed, scanning the room slowly, 2 other faces she did not immediately recognize, a well-dressed stranger seated near the side wall who kept glancing toward the door as though expecting someone, and a thin, unremarkable man in a dark coat standing near the back whom she recognized, with a small jolt, as Mr. Coombs himself. So the unseen client had sent his agent after all, exactly as Lady Beaumont had warned might happen. Eleanor kept her expression perfectly composed, though her pulse quickened slightly at the confirmation that today's contest would not be as simple as she had once hoped. The auctioneer, a stout, red-faced man named Mr. Griggs, who conducted every sale in the county with the same booming enthusiasm, regardless of what was being sold, mounted the small platform at the front of the hall and called the room to order. The murmur of conversation died away gradually, then all at once, and Eleanor felt the particular silence that settles over a crowd the moment before something important begins, a silence with weight to it, almost physical. Mr. Griggs began with a brief description of Thornfield, its acreage, its history, the current state of the manor house, delivered in the flat, practiced tone of a man who had described 100 properties before this one, and would describe 100 more after. He mentioned, in passing, the recent passing of the last Whitmore heir and the distant cousin now seeking to sell, and he mentioned too, with slightly more emphasis, that the estate would be sold as a single lot, house and land together, no division permitted, a detail that had been settled weeks earlier by the solicitor, and that Eleanor had already accounted for carefully in her own calculations. She glanced once, briefly, toward the side wall, and saw the well-dressed stranger she had noticed earlier lean forward slightly in his seat as Mr. Griggs finished his description, a small tell that confirmed, at least to her own satisfaction, that he was indeed here to bid, rather than merely to watch. She wondered whether this was the merchant from Ashworth himself, or another agent sent in his place, and she found, oddly, that it did not matter a great deal either way. Whoever he was, he represented one more obstacle standing between her and the estate she had spent weeks preparing to claim. Mr. Griggs called the room to attention a final time, announced the opening bid at the modest reserve set by the solicitor, and asked, in his booming voice, who would begin. The Duke raised his hand almost before the question had finished leaving the auctioneer's mouth, offering a sum only slightly above the opening reserve, a deliberately unhurried opening move, from a man who expected to have all the time in the world to close the sale exactly as he pleased. A murmur of approval moved through the crowd, several onlookers nodding, as though the outcome were already settled. The well-dressed stranger near the side wall raised the bid a moment later, a modest increase, enough to signal genuine interest without revealing the full extent of his intentions. The Duke turned his head slightly toward the sound, a flicker of mild surprise crossing his face, quickly smoothed away into practiced unconcern. He raised the bid again, higher this time, and Eleanor watched him settle back into his chair afterward, with the easy confidence of a man swatting away a minor inconvenience, rather than facing a genuine contest. Eleanor sat perfectly still through these opening exchanges, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing carefully even, waiting for the right moment the way she had waited through every stage of the past weeks. She was not ready to reveal herself yet. Let the Duke spend his early confidence on the stranger from the side wall. Let him believe, for as long as possible, that this unfamiliar bidder was the only obstacle worth his notice. She needed him comfortable a little while longer, needed the crowd's attention settled elsewhere, before she made the first move that would announce, unmistakably, exactly who she was, and exactly what she intended. The bidding continued for several more rounds between the Duke and the stranger, the sum climbing steadily but not yet dramatically, both men testing the other's resolve with the careful patience of experienced negotiators rather than the reckless urgency of desperate buyers. Mr. Coombe, near the back of the hall, watched every exchange closely, his own expression unreadable, and Eleanor understood, watching him, that he was likely reporting back to yet another interested party, who had chosen, for reasons of his own, not to appear in the hall today at all. It was a strange thing, Eleanor thought, sitting quietly amid all this careful maneuvering, to realize how many people had converged, from so many different directions and for so many different reasons, on a single crumbling manor house that had sat forgotten and unwanted for 2 full years before today. The land beneath Thornfield had kept its secret patiently all that time, waiting, and now, all at once, everyone who had ever caught even a faint whisper of that secret had gathered in this one hall, on this one morning, to see who would finally claim it. She waited until the bidding between the Duke and the stranger reached a figure that made several onlookers exchange surprised glances, a sum well beyond what anyone had expected the ruined estate to command, and then, in the small pause that followed the Duke's latest bid, while Mr. Griggs drew breath to ask whether any other party wished to raise the sum further. Eleanor Ashcombe rose slightly in her seat, raised her gloved hand with perfect composure, and named a figure higher still, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden startled silence that fell over the entire hall. The silence that followed lasted only a moment, before it broke into a low ripple of whispers, heads turning throughout the hall to find the source of the voice, and Eleanor sat with her hand still slightly raised, her chin level, her expression composed into the exact same calm smile she had given the Duke weeks earlier in the preview room. She watched him turn in his seat, watched the surprise cross his face as he found her among the crowd, seated where he had never once thought to look for a rival. For a moment the Duke said nothing at all, simply stared at her, with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face before, something between disbelief and faint amusement, as though he could not quite decide whether to be offended or entertained by the sight of her raising her hand at all. Beside him, Fairfax leaned close and murmured something Eleanor could not hear, and the Duke's mouth curved into a small, dismissive smile before he turned back toward the auctioneer. Mr. Griggs, delighted by the sudden turn in the proceedings, called the new figure out to the room with obvious relish and asked, in his booming voice, whether any party wished to raise it further. The Duke did not hesitate. He named a sum well above Eleanor's bid, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who still believed, even now, that this was nothing more than a brief, curious interruption before the outcome he had already decided upon. Eleanor raised her own bid again immediately, without pause, without the hesitation that might have suggested she was calculating each figure as she went, rather than executing a plan already fully formed in her mind. The stranger near the side wall, who had been the Duke's only real challenger a moment earlier, sat back in his chair, his own bidding apparently finished, watching the new contest unfold with the same startled interest as everyone else in the hall. The Duke's smile faltered slightly as he raised his bid a third time, the sum now considerably higher than the estate's original asking price, high enough that several onlookers began murmuring openly, exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to wonder whether they were witnessing something more than the simple purchase of a ruined manor house. Eleanor met his bid again without pause, and this time, when the Duke turned to look at her, the amusement had left his face entirely, replaced by something sharper, more focused, the look of a man beginning, for the first time, to take an opponent seriously. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the particular edge he had used weeks earlier in the preview room, though quieter now, more controlled. "Are you quite certain you understand what you are bidding on? This is not a matter of pride, madam. The sums involved are considerable." A ripple of laughter moved through part of the crowd, though it was thinner than it might have been weeks earlier, uncertain now, as though the room itself had begun to sense that something unusual was unfolding. Eleanor let the laughter fade before she answered, her voice carrying the same calm clarity it had held from the very start. "I understand precisely what I am bidding on, Your Grace," she said. "I have understood it, I suspect, rather longer than you have." The words landed with more weight than their simplicity suggested, and Eleanor watched the Duke's expression shift again, the sharp focus deepening into something closer to unease, though he covered it quickly, raising his bid once more with a firmness that seemed intended as much to reassure himself as to intimidate her. Eleanor answered immediately, her own bid rising to match him without the slightest hesitation, and the crowd, sensing now that this was no longer a brief curiosity, but a genuine contest between two determined parties, fell into a hush, broken only by the steady rhythm of Mr. Griggs calling out each new figure as it arrived. Near the back of the hall, Mr. Coombe had gone very still, his earlier detached observation replaced by an intensity that suggested he was now reporting, in his own mind at least, something considerably more significant than he had expected to witness that morning. The merchant's agent by the side wall leaned forward as well, watching closely, clearly recalculating whatever plans he had walked into the hall carrying that day. The Duke raised his bid a fifth time, and for the first time Eleanor noticed the smallest hesitation before he spoke, a fraction of a second longer than his previous pauses, the kind of hesitation that comes not from strategy, but from a man doing quiet arithmetic in his head, and not entirely liking the answer he was finding there. She thought of Percival, whom she had never met, but whose careful, worried figures she could almost picture now, invisible but present, shadowing every bid the Duke made. She answered his fifth bid without pause, raising the sum again, And this time, when he turned to look at her, something had changed fully in his expression. The confidence that had carried him into the hall that morning, the easy certainty of a man who had never once needed to imagine losing, had thinned into something more brittle, more uncertain, though he still held himself with the same outward composure, still sat straight in his chair, still spoke when he spoke with the same practiced authority. Fairfax leaned close to him again, and this time, Eleanor caught a fragment of his murmured words. Something about caution, about perhaps letting the matter rest at its current figure, and she watched the Duke's jaw tighten slightly before he shook his head, almost imperceptibly, and raised his bid, a sixth time regardless, his pride, it seemed, unwilling to yield ground in front of a hall full of witnesses, even as his own friend urged restraint. Eleanor felt, in that moment, the full weight of what Mr. Whitlock had told her weeks earlier in his narrow office above the bank, that the Duke was a man who had never needed to prepare for failure, and that a man like that, faced with the prospect of losing in public, would often push himself further than sense allowed simply to avoid the shame of stopping. She understood, watching him now, that she was no longer simply bidding against his reserve. She was bidding against his pride, a far more dangerous and far less predictable opponent, and she would need every ounce of the patience she had spent weeks cultivating to see this through to its end, without losing her own nerve in the process. She raised her bid a sixth time as well, her voice as steady as it had been from the very first moment she rose in her seat, and across the hall, she watched Mr. Griggs's eyes widen slightly as he called out the new figure, a sum now so far beyond the estate's original asking price that several members of the crowd had stopped whispering entirely and simply stared, transfixed, waiting to see which of the two would be the first to falter. The Duke did not answer immediately this time. He sat very still for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Eleanor across the crowded hall, and for the first time since the preview room weeks earlier, she watched him truly look at her, not as an inconvenience to be dismissed with a sharp word, not as a curiosity to be laughed away with his friends, but as an opponent, whose resolve he could no longer predict or dismiss, and whose next move he genuinely did not know how to anticipate. The hall waited, silent and expectant, for whatever he would say next. The pause stretched long enough that Mr. Griggs shifted his weight on the small platform, glancing between the two bidders with the practiced patience of a man who had learned, over many years of auctions, that the most important moments often arrived in silence rather than in noise. Somewhere behind Eleanor, she heard Lady Beaumont draw a slow, careful breath, and she resisted the urge to turn and look at her friend, keeping her eyes fixed instead on the Duke, refusing to give him even the smallest sign that the waiting cost her anything at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried at the start of the morning, replaced by something more deliberate, more carefully controlled, the tone of a man choosing his next words with real caution, for perhaps the first time that day. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, "may I ask what interest a widow of your modest means holds in an estate requiring this degree of investment? I ask not to insult you, but out of genuine curiosity. Thornfield, in its current state, offers little beyond the pleasure of restoring an old house. Surely there are wiser uses for funds of this size." It was, Eleanor understood immediately, an attempt to draw information from her in front of the entire hall, a subtle test to see whether she would reveal, under the pressure of public scrutiny, some hint of the reason behind her determination. She considered her answer carefully before giving it, aware that every word she spoke now would be repeated and re-repeated throughout the county for weeks to come. "I have my reasons, Your Grace," she said evenly. "I did not ask you to explain your interest in the estate when you first expressed it, and I do not believe you owe me an explanation now. I would extend you the same courtesy." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through parts of the crowd, and Eleanor saw, from the corner of her eye, Lady Beaumont press her lips together to hide a smile of her own. The Duke's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a point fairly made even as it clearly displeased him. "Very well," he said, and raised his bid again, a seventh time, the sum climbing higher still. Eleanor answered without hesitation, matching him instantly, and this time she allowed herself, for just a moment, to hold his gaze steadily across the width of the hall, letting him see in her expression exactly what she wanted him to see. Not defiance exactly, not triumph, but simple, unwavering certainty, the look of a person who had already decided, long before entering this room, precisely how far she was prepared to go. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of genuine uncertainty breaking through the composure he had worked so hard to maintain. He turned briefly toward Fairfax, who leaned close and spoke in a voice pitched too low for Eleanor to hear, though his expression suggested the advice was not what the Duke wished to hear. The Duke's jaw tightened again, and he turned back toward the auctioneer. Near the back of the hall, Mr. Coombe had begun writing something quickly in a small notebook, and the merchant's agent by the side wall had settled back in his chair entirely, his own interest in the bidding clearly exhausted, content now simply to watch the remaining contest play out between the two determined figures who had, without either of them quite intending it, become the sole focus of every eye in the room. The Duke raised his bid an eighth time, and Eleanor noticed, with the same sharp attention she had once given the old ledgers in her husband's study, that his voice carried a fraction less certainty than it had at the start, a small crack in the smooth authority he had spent his whole life cultivating. She matched him again immediately, and this time, before Mr. Griggs could even finish calling out the new figure, the Duke spoke again, his voice sharper now, edged with something that had not been present earlier in the morning. "This is madness," he said, not quite to Eleanor, not quite to the room at large, more to himself, though everyone present heard it clearly. "No sensible person spends this sum on a ruin." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said quietly, "the ruin is not quite what either of us believed it to be when this morning began." The words settled over the hall with unexpected weight, and Eleanor watched several faces in the crowd turn toward one another, murmuring, clearly beginning to wonder, for the first time, whether there was more to this contest than a widow's stubborn pride and a duke's wounded vanity. She had said more than she intended, she realized immediately afterward, more than her careful plan called for, but the words were already spoken, already settling into the minds of everyone present, and there was no calling them back now. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with new intensity, as though trying to read, in the small shift of her expression, exactly what she meant by the remark. Eleanor held perfectly still under his scrutiny, giving nothing further away, and after a long moment, he turned back toward the auctioneer, and raised his bid a ninth time, his voice carrying a forced steadiness that did not entirely mask the strain beneath it. Eleanor matched him again, and this time, as Mr. Griggs called out the figure, she heard, from somewhere near the front of the hall, a low whistle of astonishment from one of the onlookers, followed by a fresh wave of whispered conversation that Mr. Griggs had to raise his own voice slightly to speak over. The sum now bid for Thornfield had climbed to a height that no one in that hall, including Eleanor herself in her most careful calculations, had truly expected to see reach that morning. She thought, briefly, of the additional funds Mr. Whitlock had cautioned her against relying upon unless truly necessary, and she understood, with a small cold clarity, that she was drawing close to the edge of what she could safely offer, without stepping into exactly the kind of exposed position he had warned her about. She did not let the thought show on her face. She had come too far now to allow even the smallest crack in her composure, not with the Duke watching her this closely, not with the entire hall waiting to see which of them would be the first to break. The Duke, for his part, appeared to be fighting a similar battle within himself, his hand tightening slightly on the arm of his chair, his eyes flicking once, briefly, toward Fairfax, who gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent warning Eleanor was almost certain the Duke intended to ignore. He raised his bid a 10th time, his voice rougher now, stripped of the polished ease it had carried at the beginning of the morning, replaced by something closer to raw determination, a man no longer bidding out of calm confidence, but out of the sheer, stubborn unwillingness to be the one who yielded first, in front of everyone he knew, to a widow he had publicly dismissed only weeks before. Eleanor understood, watching him, that they had both crossed some invisible line together, moving past reasonable strategy into something rawer and more personal. A contest, now less about Thornfield itself, and more about which of them would prove, in this crowded hall, exactly who they truly were, underneath the roles the county had assigned them. She drew a slow, steady breath, felt the weight of every eye in the room resting on her, and raised her hand once more to match him. Mr. Griggs called out Eleanor's 10th bid, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier booming enthusiasm, replaced now by a kind of careful astonishment, as though even he, a man who had auctioned countless properties over the years, understood that he was witnessing something the county would speak of for a long time to come. The hall had gone almost completely silent, the earlier murmurs and whispers dying away entirely, leaving only the sound of Mr. Griggs's voice and the occasional creak of a chair as someone shifted forward to see more clearly. The Duke sat very still, his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, not quite on Eleanor, not quite on the auctioneer, and Eleanor recognized, watching him, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid, unwelcome arithmetic behind an otherwise composed expression. She thought again of Percival, of the careful figures he had almost certainly shown the Duke weeks earlier. Figures the Duke had likely dismissed, without a second thought, and she wondered whether he was thinking of them now, whether the narrow margins Percival had warned him about were closing in around him, in this very moment, in front of every friend and neighbor he had ever known. Fairfax leaned close again, his voice a low, urgent murmur that Eleanor could not fully make out, though she caught enough fragments to understand its shape. Something about the stables, about the North Wing renovations, about funds that could not simply be conjured from nothing, no matter how badly a man wished to win. The Duke's expression tightened with each word, his jaw working slightly, and Eleanor watched a flush rise slowly along his neck, the particular color of a proud man realizing, in the worst possible setting, that his pride had led him further than his means could follow. "Your Grace," Mr. Griggs said carefully, breaking the long silence, "do you wish to raise the bid further?" The Duke did not answer immediately. He glanced once more at Fairfax, who gave a small, tight shake of his head, and then, for the briefest instant, his eyes met Eleanor's across the width of the hall. She held his gaze steadily, offering nothing, neither triumph nor pity, simply the same calm composure she had carried since the moment she first rose in her seat, and something in that stillness seemed to settle the matter for him more completely than any argument Fairfax might have made. "I have no further bid," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the whole hall to hear, though it had lost every trace of the easy confidence with which he had opened the morning's proceedings. The words landed over the crowded room, like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of astonished whispering spreading outward in every direction, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying so long she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. She kept her expression composed, refusing to let relief show too plainly on her face, aware that the moment was not yet finished, that Mr. Griggs still needed to call the final figure 3 times before the sale could be considered complete. "Going once," Mr. Griggs called, his voice carrying the practiced weight such moments required, at the sum offered by Lady Ashcombe. The hall remained silent, every eye moving between Eleanor and the Duke, waiting to see whether either the merchant's agent by the side wall or some other hidden party might yet raise a hand and extend the contest further. No one moved. The stranger by the side wall sat with his arms folded, clearly finished, and Mr. Combe, near the back, had stopped writing entirely, watching now with the stillness of a man who understood he had witnessed something he would need to report very carefully indeed. "Going twice," Mr. Griggs called, and Eleanor felt Lady Beaumont's hand find her shoulder from the row behind, a brief, steadying pressure that Eleanor did not turn to acknowledge, but that she felt gratefully all the same. The silence held. Somewhere near the front, a chair creaked as someone leaned forward, and Eleanor became aware, in the strange heightened clarity of the moment, of small details she would remember for a long time afterward. The pale morning light slanting through the tall windows, the smell of old wood polish rising from the assembly room floor, the particular quality of silence that falls over a crowd of people all holding their breath at once. "Sold," Mr. Griggs said finally, his voice ringing out across the hall, to Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. The word seemed to hang in the air for a moment, before the hall erupted into a fresh wave of noise, whispered conversation rising quickly into something closer to open exclamation, dozens of voices all speaking at once, some in evident astonishment, a few, Eleanor was pleased to note, in what sounded distinctly like admiration. She remained seated for a long moment, letting the noise wash over her, allowing herself, finally, the smallest private breath of relief before she rose from her chair. The Duke had not moved. He sat exactly where he had been sitting through the entire final exchange, his eyes fixed now on some point on the floor in front of him. His earlier flush deepened into something closer to pallor, the particular stillness of a man absorbing, in real time, the full weight of what had just happened to him, in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to him. Eleanor rose from her seat and moved slowly through the crowd toward the front of the hall, aware of the eyes following her every step, aware too, in a distant, floating way, that the story of this morning would be told and retold across the county for years to come, embellished and reshaped exactly as her earlier embarrassment had been, though the shape of this new telling, she suspected, would favor her considerably more than the last one had. She stopped a short distance from where the Duke sat, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to remain visible to the entire watching hall, and she waited until he lifted his eyes to meet hers, waited through the long, uncomfortable moment while he composed himself enough to hold her gaze without flinching. Neither of them spoke at first. The noise of the hall continued around them, distant now, as though the two of them stood at the center of a small pocket of stillness the crowd's excitement could not quite penetrate. Eleanor watched the Duke's expression shift through several stages, disbelief giving way slowly to something more complicated. Not quite anger, not quite admiration, something closer to the particular discomfort of a man forced, for the first time in his adult life, to see himself clearly through someone else's eyes. She let the silence stretch a moment longer, and then, with the same graceful composure she had shown him weeks earlier in the preview room, Eleanor Ashcombe lowered herself into a slow, deliberate curtsy. The hall, which had been buzzing with excited conversation only a moment before, quieted again as people noticed what was happening near the front of the room, the same low hush falling over the crowd that had accompanied the final rounds of bidding, everyone straining now to see and hear whatever passed between the Duke and the woman who had just defeated him in front of the entire county. Eleanor rose slowly from her curtsy, her eyes never leaving his, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly enough that there could be no mistaking her words for anyone standing nearby, though she did not raise it beyond what the moment required. "I did not request your opinion either, Your Grace," she said, echoing, deliberately and precisely, the very words he had spoken to her weeks earlier in the preview room, the words that had sent her home that afternoon to open her husband's old ledgers for the first time in years. The Duke's face went through another slow transformation, and Eleanor watched understanding settle fully into his expression, watched him recognize, perhaps for the first time since the bidding began, that this had never truly been about Thornfield alone, that the estate had simply become the vessel for a reckoning that had started the moment he chose to speak to her the way he had, in front of witnesses, assuming she would simply absorb the insult and disappear quietly back into the background, where he believed women of her sort belonged. He did not answer immediately. Several long seconds passed, during which the hall remained almost entirely silent, waiting, and Eleanor held her ground, unwilling to fill the silence herself, unwilling to soften the moment with any further words that might blunt the point she had just made so precisely. Finally, the Duke rose from his chair, and for a moment, Eleanor wondered whether he intended to storm from the hall entirely, whether pride would carry him out the door without another word spoken between them. Instead, he stood facing her fully, and something in his posture had changed, the easy arrogance gone, replaced by a stiffness that suggested real effort, the visible strain of a man forcing himself to say something his pride resisted with every fiber. "You have made your point, Lady Ashcombe," he said, his voice quieter than Eleanor had ever heard it, stripped of its usual commanding edge. "I confess I did not think you capable of this. I was wrong to say what I said, and wrong again, it seems, in a great many assumptions since." It was not a full apology, not quite, but Eleanor understood, watching the visible cost of even these few words to a man who had likely never once admitted fault in public in his entire life, that it was as close as the Duke of Harrogate was capable of coming, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need more than this to feel the matter settled. She had not come to that hall seeking his contrition. She had come seeking Thornfield, and Thornfield was now hers. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said simply, and inclined her head, a small, measured gesture, neither warm nor cold, the acknowledgement one gives a fair point honestly conceded. Around them, the crowd began to stir again, the tension of the moment breaking into fresh murmurs of conversation, and Eleanor became aware of Lady Beaumont pushing gently through the throng toward her, her face alight with an expression somewhere between pride and barely contained laughter. Mr. Whitlock, too, had risen from his seat near the back, moving forward with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who understood that his part in the morning's drama, while essential, was not the part anyone in that hall needed to notice. Fairfax approached the Duke and said something quiet, his hand resting briefly on his friend's shoulder, and the Duke nodded, still visibly shaken, still absorbing the shape of what had just happened to him, before allowing himself to be guided gently toward the door, away from the crowd of onlookers who had, only an hour earlier, gathered to watch him win easily, and had instead witnessed something far more memorable. Eleanor watched him go, and found, as his figure disappeared through the tall doors of the assembly hall, that she felt no triumph in his departure, no particular satisfaction in his visible discomfort. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, a sense of having finally, after 4 long years of careful smallness, claimed something entirely her own, built with her own patience and her own judgment, in full view of everyone who had ever doubted either. Lady Beaumont reached her a moment later, embracing her without any regard for the many watching eyes still lingering nearby, and Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the tension of the past weeks finally breaking loose all at once. "You wicked, wonderful woman," Lady Beaumont said, pulling back to look at her properly. "I do not believe this county will speak of anything else for a full year." "Let them speak of it," Eleanor said, still smiling. "I find I no longer mind what they say, so long as it is finally true." Mr. Whitlock arrived a moment later, offering a brief, formal bow, along with words of quiet congratulation, though his eyes carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had taken a risk on someone's judgment and watched it prove entirely sound. He mentioned, in a low voice meant only for Eleanor, that the necessary papers would be ready within the week, and that he looked forward, sincerely, to seeing what she built upon the foundation she had just secured. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, drifting out into the pale morning light in small clusters of animated conversation, Eleanor remained standing near the front of the hall a moment longer, looking around at the space where, only minutes earlier, her entire future had been decided in front of half the county. She thought of the ledgers in her husband's study, of Mr. Pruitt's careful old notes, of the many quiet evenings spent building, piece by piece, toward exactly this moment, and she felt, more than anything else, a deep and settled gratitude, not toward the Duke, whose insult had merely been the spark, but toward herself, for having refused, in the end, to let that spark die out unused. She walked out of the assembly hall into the bright morning air a short while later, Edmund already waiting with the carriage exactly where she had left him, and as she climbed inside and settled against the seat, she allowed herself, finally, to imagine in full detail everything that now lay ahead. The restoration of Thornfield's east wing, the careful work of uncovering the slate vein beneath its fields, the slow, satisfying transformation of a forgotten ruin into something entirely her own, built not on inheritance or marriage or the permission of any man, but on her own quiet, patient, unshakable will. 6 months passed before the first wagon loads of slate began rolling out from the eastern fields of Thornfield, gray stone stacked high and gleaming faintly under the autumn sun, bound for the roofing merchants of the northern towns who had, within weeks of the first samples reaching them, begun placing orders larger than Eleanor had dared hope for, even in her most optimistic calculations. Mr. Pruitt had been right about the vein, and generous in his estimate besides, the slate proving finer in quality than even the old mining survey had suggested, prized particularly for its resistance to frost, a rare and valuable trait in a county known for hard winters. Eleanor stood at the edge of the eastern field on a cool October morning, watching the workmen load another wagon, and found herself thinking, as she often did now, of the woman who had walked these same fields alone 6 months earlier, imagining what they might become. That woman had been hopeful, but uncertain, carrying a plan built more on careful hope than proven fact. The woman standing there now had accounts to review each evening that grew steadily, satisfyingly, in her favor. A restored east wing, with a roof that no longer let in a single drop of rain, and a household of workers who greeted her each morning, not as a curiosity to be whispered about, but as the woman whose judgment had built the very livelihood they now depended upon. The house itself had transformed almost as thoroughly as the land beneath it. The crumbling east wing that had first caught her attention in the auction preview room now stood fully repaired, its stonework cleaned and its old windows replaced, and Eleanor had begun, in the evenings when the workmen's hammers finally fell silent, walking through the newly restored rooms simply for the pleasure of seeing what patient attention could accomplish, where 2 years of neglect had nearly won. George, the old caretaker who had once shown her quietly around the grounds as an interested stranger, still lived on the property, now formally employed as head of the household staff, a position he had accepted with visible pride, and had filled, in the months since, with the same steady loyalty he had once given the Whitmore family who no longer existed to receive it. Word of the slate had spread through the county quickly, of course, exactly as Eleanor had known it would once the first wagons began their journeys north, and the story of the auction itself had transformed along with it, reshaped and retold at every tea table and market stall, until it had become, in most versions Eleanor overheard secondhand, a tale of remarkable foresight and quiet daring, rather than the foolish embarrassment it had briefly been mistaken for in the weeks before the sale. Lady Beaumont, delighted by the shift, made a small private habit of correcting the more exaggerated tellings whenever she encountered them, though she admitted to Eleanor, with obvious amusement, that some of the embellished versions were rather more entertaining than the truth. Mr. Whitlock called on Thornfield twice that autumn, once purely on business, to review the accounts, and confirm that the arrangement he had structured months earlier had proven every bit as sound as he had hoped, and once, near the end of October, simply to see the restored house for himself, walking through the newly finished rooms with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had staked his own judgment on someone else's and watched it repaid many times over. He mentioned, on that second visit, that word of Eleanor's success had reached beyond the county itself, that other widows and daughters of modest means had begun quietly inquiring at his bank about arrangements similar to the one he had made for her, encouraged by a story that suggested such ambitions need not remain forever out of reach. The Duke, for his part, had not called on Thornfield at all, though Eleanor heard, through the usual channels of county gossip, that his manner had shifted noticeably in the months following the auction, that he spoke less often and less loudly at gatherings, that he had begun, according to more than one source, actually reviewing his own accounts with Percival, rather than dismissing the steward's careful warnings out of hand. She did not know whether this change would last, whether a man raised his entire life to believe his opinions carried more weight than anyone else's could truly be reshaped by a single public defeat, however thorough. But she found, thinking of him now from the settled distance of half a year, that she no longer carried any particular anger toward him at all. He had given her, without meaning to, the sharpest possible reason to finally reach for something she had spent 4 quiet years convincing herself she did not deserve, and whatever became of him now was, in the end, entirely his own concern to manage. She had received, in early September, a brief formal letter from him, delivered by his own hand rather than a servant's, congratulating her on the success of the slate operation, and noting, in careful, measured language, that he had perhaps been hasty in his earlier assessment of both the estate and its owner. Eleanor had read the letter twice, recognized it for the considerable effort it clearly represented, and replied with an equally brief note thanking him for his good wishes, closing the small correspondence between them with the same measured grace she had shown him in the auction hall itself. There was no need for anything more elaborate. Some matters, once properly settled, required nothing further to remain settled. On a clear afternoon in late October, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the eastern field, watching another wagon of slate depart down the long lane toward the county road, and Lady Beaumont, who had ridden out to visit that morning, stood beside her, watching the same scene with visible satisfaction. "Do you ever think," Lady Beaumont asked, "of how differently this might have gone, if you had simply accepted his rudeness that day and gone quietly home, without another thought of Thornfield at all?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, watching the wagon grow smaller in the distance, the autumn light catching the gray stones stacked high behind the driver. "I think of it sometimes," she admitted, "though I find I cannot truly imagine it anymore. That version of the story feels like something that happened to someone else, someone I remember rather fondly, but do not quite recognize as myself." Lady Beaumont smiled, slipping her arm through Eleanor's as they turned together to walk back toward the house, its restored windows catching the same afternoon light that fell across the fields, warm and steady and entirely her own. "Perhaps that is the truest measure of it," she said. "Not the money, not even the house itself, fine as it has become, simply that you are no longer someone who could imagine going quietly home." Eleanor thought about this the rest of the walk back, past the newly repaired stables, past George directing 2 workmen toward the last of the day's loading, up the stone path toward the front door of the house that had once been a ruin no one wanted and was now, unmistakably, thriving. She thought of the Duke's sharp words in the preview room, words meant to end a conversation before it began, and of everything those words had accidentally set in motion instead, and she found, standing on the threshold of the home she had built entirely through her own patient will, that she felt something close to gratitude, even for the insult itself, since it had done what 4 quiet years of careful widowhood never had, reminded her, in one sharp, unwelcome moment, exactly how much she was still capable of reaching for, and exactly how far that reach could carry her, when she finally stopped asking permission to make it.